Thanks very much. It's very good to have the opportunity to talk to you. I'm the head of climate change and communities at the Environment Agency, and I oversee work on various cross-cutting issues. And at the moment, that includes overseeing our work on the regulation of shale gas extraction. And I'm going to try and set out to you how the regulatory framework works in Great Britain. I'm not going to talk about Northern Ireland, incidentally. The regulatory framework there is similar, but a bit different. So I'm going to focus on England, Scotland, and Wales. And so just to start, really the next slide is just to highlight to you which are the main regulatory authorities involved, not least so you can recognise the acronyms on subsequent slides. So we have the Department of Energy and Climate Change. I guess is primarily the economic regulator in this field, and as I'll come on to describe, licenses this activity through petroleum licenses, but actually under petroleum licensing has quite wide-ranging powers to put conditions in place that matter environmentally, amongst other things. For example, they can regulate flaring and venting of fugitive gases, including methane, and of course they would be responsible for requiring, if they allow fracking to resume, any mitigatory actions that are required to manage seismic activity. Then the Environment Agency in England and Wales is the principal environmental regulator. Our sister organisation, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, does that activity north of the border. The Health and Safety Executive, as its name would imply, is the primary health and safety at work regulator in this arena. And then we also have the important role that local authorities play through the planning system in regulating this activity. And here we're talking about minerals planning authorities, the upper tier authorities. So you're talking about unitary authorities or county councils, generally speaking. And the next slide will show how this regulatory framework all fits together. So first of all, if you want to carry out extraction or exploration, actually, first of all, for shale gas or indeed any other sort of gas or petroleum, then you need a license from the Department of Energy and Climate Change. If you then have a license, the next stage is to seek planning permission for that activity, and of course planning permission is done on a site-by-site basis of assessment. The Environment Agency and SEPA are statutory consultees in that process. So we will advise the local authority on whether particular conditions need to be put on planning permission to protect the environment. And indeed, at that point, we will come in and do our own site assessment to see whether there are particular environmental risks which require particular authorizations from us. And I'll come on to describe that in more detail. Also, at this stage comes in the Health and Safety Executive in the sense that the Health and Safety Executive has to be notified if there is intention to drill. And the Health and Safety Executive's regulations then come into force, and I'll describe those in more detail a bit later as well. Important to say that both the Environment Agency and the Health and Safety Executive have powers to stop activities if we think they are presenting to greater risk. And indeed, alternatively, if we think the risks can be managed, we have the power to put conditions on those activities. And if you take planning permission, for example, we would always advise the local authority, and the local authority would take our advice, for example, to require impermeable lining and bunding of the site, so that even if there were spills on site, they couldn't escape into the wider environment. But that's just an example of the kind of condition that you can use planning permission for. Now, providing that the right authorisations are achieved, you can then go ahead with testing, and during the testing phase through exploration, we and the other regulators will keep a close eye on the activity, subject to whether that those exploratory activities prove to be fruitful. You might then, as not a developer, want to go on to the development stage. But it's important to emphasise, actually, that the permission to explore for shale gas and other forms of petroleum and gas is not the same as the permission to develop to commercial stage. If you want to do that, you then, in essence, have to go through getting another set of permissions. So assuming that the exploration phase has been fruitful, you would then need to go back, you would then need to go back to the local authority to get further planning permission to develop the field. At that stage, the level of activity is likely to be large enough to require that a full environmental impact assessment is carried out as part of getting planning permission. Again, the Environment Agency, or the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, is a statutory consultee in that process and will advise on which risks need to be considered. You will also have to develop a field development plan for the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and that indeed also requires that an environmental statement is submitted, and that environmental statement is, generally speaking, the same as the environmental impact assessment. So there's a sort of double lock there. And again, the Environment Agency, or the Scottish Environment Agency, or the Health and Safety Executive's authorisations come into play. And only when all of that has been accomplished are you allowed to go ahead to develop to a commercial stage. And it's very important to emphasise at the moment that of course, and you probably heard this earlier in the day, that all hydraulic fracturing activity for shale gas exploration is suspended pending the government's response to Professor Stiles and others' expert report on the seismic events at Priest Hall. So there is currently no permission from DEC to carry out any fracking anywhere in England, Wales or Scotland. And even when it's allowed to resume, we're still very much at the early stages of exploration. We're a considerable way off getting to the stage where there may be development of commercial exploitation. So having given you the sort of overall outline of the regulatory framework, I'll come on to discuss components of it in a bit more detail. You've seen the map on the left a number of times, I think, during the course of today, but I put it up again only because I wanted to show you the map on the right, which is areas currently with petroleum exploration and development licenses from the Department of Energy and Climate Change. And this area up here is actually an inset showing in more detail. I'm sorry it's not clearer than it might be, but this is an inset of the licensing that has happened in the northwest of England. So overall, at the moment, the Department of Energy and Climate Change have licensed nearly 1 million hectares of land area for petroleum exploration and development. But again, for any particular area, you'd have to go through all of those authorization processes I highlighted to you earlier. The Environment Agency's initial assessment is that about a quarter of those licensed areas are in what we call source protection zones. That they are zones that are particularly important, as Rob Ward was describing, for groundwater used potentially for drinking water. And so we would have strong, on a risk basis, stronger concerns about this activity being developed in those areas. We are anticipating that later in the year, DEC will be doing another round of petroleum licensing, but I suspect that will not be until conclusions have been reached about whether to allow hydraulic fracturing for exploratory activity to resume. Just to give you a picture of where the Environment Agency is at the moment, this is very much a live issue for us in a number of different places around England and Wales. We are aware of proposals to explore potentially for shale gas as well as for conventional hydrocarbons. That of course includes the sites in Lancashire, including Priest Hall, that Quadrilla are looking into, but it includes various other sites around England and in South Wales as well. But I again want to emphasise that at the moment there is no permission to do any fracking at any of these sites. The Health and Safety Executive play an important regulatory role, and they of course operate under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and here in particular under the borehole regulations. And the borehole regulations contain some important principles designed to ensure that wells are well designed, constructed and operated. And in particular, they require the operator to appoint an independent assessor to oversee the design, construction and operation of the well. And the assessor has to be properly qualified in the eyes of the Health and Safety Executive and has to be satisfied that the operator, the developer, is doing things in a proper way. And if they are not satisfied of that, they can inform the Health and Safety Executive of their concerns, and the Health and Safety Executive has powers to stop activities if they consider that the risks are too great. Coming on to environmental regulation, and this really builds on many of the things that Rob Ward was saying, and this particular picture is designed to summarise what are the main environmental risks associated with extracting shale gas using hydraulic fracturing. And they of course range from the large volumes of water that are used for this process, the hydraulic fracturing activity itself, and the risks that chemicals may leak into the wider environment if the right controls are not put in to place, the risks associated with the disposal of the waste fluids that come back to the surface consequent to hydraulic fracturing, and indeed the safe storage and disposal of those waste fluids, and indeed the risk of fugitive emissions of methane and other gases which matter both for human health and indeed because methane is a potent greenhouse gas, they matter from a point of view of mitigating climate change risk. And now I would agree with Rob's assessment that we think that the main risks are those associated with near to surface or surface activities, and they are mainly to do with, on the one hand, the design, construction and operation of the well itself, and on the other, the way in which you deal with the waste fluids. Now, the main environmental legislation that we're dealing with, which gives us power to manage those risks, that are at European level, as Rob has already mentioned, the Water Framework Directive and the Groundwater Directive. In addition to that, the Mining Waste Directive, because the fracking fluid is considered to be a mining waste and needs to be dealt with in the terms of that legislation. And those pieces of European legislation are implemented at domestic level in England and Wales through the environmental permitting regulations, which give the Environment Agency fairly broad powers to put conditions on operations or indeed to stop operations if we think that the risks are too great or to prevent them from happening in the first place, and through the Water Resources Act. And the Water Resources Act, on the one hand, requires operators to notify us if they have an intention to drill, on the other to tell us which chemicals they plan to use in the hydraulic fracturing process, so that we can make an assessment of those chemicals and decide whether we think it's appropriate that those chemicals are used. And the Water Resources Act also gives the Environment Agency the power to license water abstraction. And the volumes of water that are used in a process like hydraulic fracturing are large enough that licensing of abstraction will be required either directly because the operator, if it's seeking to abstract water for hydraulic fracturing direct from the environment, would need to have a license from us, or indirectly. So, for example, in the case of Quadrilla, where actually it is using a public water supply from United Utilities, it's United Utilities who have to have an abstraction license to abstract and use that volume of water. And one thing I would want to emphasize is that the Environment Agency would not license unsustainable levels of abstraction of water from the environment. And we do a careful catchment-based assessment to see what level of water abstraction is sustainable in that catchment, and we will not license to a level beyond that. The next slide summarises in many ways which pieces of legislation apply to which risk. But as I've described, we think we've got regulatory powers that pretty well cover all of the environmental risks that have been identified. And in some cases, more than one set of regulations cover the environmental risks. And perhaps the piece of legislation that we're doing most work on at the moment to understand its full impact is the Mining Waste Directive, because the European Commission, as I've described, has advised us that we need to treat the waste fracking fluids as a mining waste, and therefore they must be regulated under that piece of legislation. And that actually requires the environmental permitting regulations to be implemented. The operator will need a permit from the Environment Agency in order to dispose of, in a proper way, the return fracking fluids. And actually, we think that may also give us the power to regulate fugitive emissions that are associated with the return of the waste fluids to the surface. But in any case, those emissions can be regulated directly by the Department of Energy and Climate Change under petroleum licensing. I've mentioned mainly the environmental risks that are under the regulation of the Environment Agency and the other national regulators, but it's quite important to remember that there are other environmental impacts from this activity that are of great concern to communities in the locations where this activity may occur. And they, of course, relate to impact on the visual environment. They relate to the noise and dust created by operations at that site, the potential for lights if it's a 24-hour operation, which may be considered to be a nuisance by neighbouring communities, the amount of traffic that is generated to and from the site, and so forth. Those risks are mainly dealt with through the planning system and through whether or not planning permission is given and what conditions are attached to planning permission. So where does the Environment Agency stand overall at this stage of the early stages of exploration for shale gas in England and Wales? Well, our overall assessment is that the current regulatory framework is adequate, at least for now, during small-scale exploration. We think that we have the necessary powers to manage the environmental risks as we understand them, but we are keeping that under review, and we're doing some further work to ensure that we have all the information that we need going forward should this activity develop to a larger commercial scale, both so that we can implement the powers that we have properly, but also to make sure that we have the necessary powers that we need to manage all of the risks. And we are taking what we are calling a responsible as well as a risk-based approach to this newly emerging industry. And if I say a little bit about what I mean by that, it means that we've been actually quite proactive in the way that we've gone about regulating this new activity. So if you take Quadrilla's activities in Lancashire, for example, they have actually declared to us the chemicals that they propose to use and have used in one case in fracking at Priest Hall. We made an assessment of those chemicals under the terms of the Groundwater Daughter Directive, and under that directive we assess whether the chemicals are hazardous, as Rob was saying earlier, and that basically means an assessment of whether they are highly toxic, persistent in the environment and bioaccumulative. And actually we have judged the chemicals that they have proposed to use as being non-hazardous in the terms of the Groundwater Directive. And that assessment has been confirmed by the Joint Agencies Advisory Group on Groundwater Protection. And that Joint Agencies Group includes the Scottish Environment Protection Agency and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, as well as ourselves. So we think we've taken a pretty careful approach to that. We do a site-by-site assessment when there is a proposal or proposals to explore for shale gas, and we've done that for each of the sites where there has been a proposition for this activity. And in the case of the sites in Lancashire, we have made and continue to make numerous site visits to ensure that operations are taking place in the way that they were planned to be done. We proactively took samples from the returned fracking fluids from the Priest Hall site, the only case where there has been any fracking so far, and we took those samples away and undertook our own analysis of those samples to see what was in it. And we've published our analysis on our website for all to see. As you would expect, we found there to be considerable levels of mineral salts and low levels of naturally occurring radioactive materials, which under the terms of the radioactive substances regulations require for that purpose alone that an environmental permit is needed in order to dispose of those waste fluids safely, and consequently the return fluids from fracking at Priest Hall are currently stored on site in double-lined tanks, and it won't be possible for them to be disposed of unless and until they have applied for and received an environmental permit from the Environment Agency, and they won't get that unless we are satisfied that their plans to manage the risks associated with that are adequate. In general, we're taking a very risk-based and responsible approach. But we are also aware that we don't necessarily have all the information that we need to be an effective regulator. If instead of this being relatively isolated, small-scale cases, this industry grows to a larger scale. And so we are undertaking further work, a full and detailed environmental assessment over the course of this financial year. And in doing that, and in general actually, we are working very closely with the Department of Energy and Climate Change and the Welsh Government and our fellow regulators. So last slide is just to tell you about the next steps. Well, of course, we are awaiting the Department of Energy and Climate Change's response to the expert report on seismic activity, and indeed the public comments on that expert report, which were invited by the department. And then, of course, unless and until the Department of Energy and Climate Change is satisfied that this activity can resume in a safe and responsible way, no further hydraulic fracturing is currently taking place. As I mentioned, we ourselves are undertaking a detailed environmental assessment of the full life cycle of this activity to make sure that we fully understand all of the risks, that we've got all the information we require to regulate those risks properly, and that we've translated that into guidance that our operational staff in the field can use. Because one of the chief environmental risks is that there is a failure of well integrity, and therefore the health and safety executives' borehole regulations matter not just from the point of view of protecting people, but also of protecting the environment. We've been undertaking a piece of work to review the borehole regulations to ensure that they meet environmental goals as well as public health and safety objectives. We've also, because we don't think there is a great deal of peer-reviewed published evidence around the issue of fugitive emissions of methane, we've been focusing on that risk to make sure that we're on top of that. And the initial part of that is that we commissioned some consultants to review engineering methods for monitoring and controlling fugitive methane and other hydrocarbon emissions. We are being very careful to ensure that we learn from our fellow regulators in other countries, because as Peter Starr's map was showing earlier, this is a common issue across many other countries, many fellow member states of the European Union, and Canada and the United States and elsewhere. So we've been making sure that we have our networks built up and we can learn from their experience as well. And we have been very directly contributing to a European Union technical working group on this subject, so that we can help to influence the development of best practice, but also learn from others about what best practice looks like. So I hope I've been able to share with you some information to show that we do have a pretty robust regulatory system within England and Wales, and in many ways it is a stronger regulatory system than exists in the United States, though the regulatory system there is on an upward and improving curve. And I'm not saying that we don't have things to learn from them. For example, the US Environmental Protection Agency has recently issued some new regulations on controlling fugitive emissions of methane. And I think we need to have a close look at those, because we might well want to do something quite similar in the United Kingdom. But we're not saying that we know everything at this stage. We are on a learning curve, and we are some way up that curve, and we're making sure that we are prepared if and when this activity goes to a larger scale. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much. We have a small amount of time for questions to Tony, and then we'll broaden it out and let Tony sit down. Please. Microphone on its way.
Hi, I'm Jane Mosley from West Sussex County Council. I've just got a small concern that the main issue people seem to have been, one of the main issues focusing on today, is the integrity of the containment of the borehole as it passes through the aquifer. And I know that in Sussex we've got one HSE person that covers the whole area from goodness knows where. So I don't know if you've had any experience, because I know in Lancashire they were saying as well that there's issues up there with the coverage, and someone from Scotland comes down and checks it, and that's just not within my area of expertise to cover as a planner. So I was just wondering if you've got issues with that.
Well, the way in which the health and safety executive operates is quite different from the way the Environment Agency operates. So we would send inspectors out to sites from the point of view of environmental regulation. The principles of health and safety executives' way of approaching is that the key thing is the appointment of this independent assessor. And it's the independent assessor who is required to ensure that the borehole is properly constructed and operated. And they keep regular tabs on that activity. And if they are not satisfied, they will then alert the health and safety executive, who will intervene. So it's not quite the same as way of operating as we would operate, where it would be our own inspector or officer who would go out to the site. But actually, we work very collaboratively with the health and safety executive, and we have agreed, for example, because of the importance of ensuring that there is public confidence in this activity, that if fracking were to resume, for example, in Lancashire, that we will do joint site visits. So the health and safety executive have already said that they too will sort of go beyond what they would normally do because this is a new and publicly sensitive
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Robert Freer. I'm an engineer. If we start producing shale gas on any significant quantity, I assume we shall need some sort of storage capacity to meet the peak winter demand. At present, we have less gas storage than almost any other European country. Would any of the speakers like to tell us what work they're doing on looking for potential storage sites?
We have a fairly, yes, Stevenson BGS. So at BGS we've been looking at gas storage for quite a while, and we have a project at the moment for mapping out salt deposits that might be suitable. And you're right, we don't store enough gas. We have about 9 days against Germany's 70, something like that. 4 days, well, rather a lot, yeah. So we are looking at that, and we do realise that's a problem.
Thank you. Question?
But pre-Shale in Lancashire, I've had several PhD students looking at caverns in salt and their stability.
Now, there was a question over here. Was that relating to Tony's? Yeah. Take that, and then we'll move on to more general discussion.
It all seems very regulated. However, in the area I come from, we've been through all these different sets of regulations, and none of it actually works because, I mean, we've had environmental impacts missing from lots of things, from nuclear power stations down to international toxic refuge tips, and over again we've taken health and safety and the environmental agency through the legal things, even as far as the appeal courts, over the way they've granted licenses for things that should have, according to your regulations, been stopped. But rather than being stopped, you just grant an extra license to cover what's been done wrong. And how can the public at large actually acknowledge that you will step in and regulate anything at all going by the past actions, and the fact that we don't have any confidence in what's going on since you changed your mission statement from protecting the public to encouraging big business, which is not the same thing at all. And as far as the public's concerned, it's just a front to push through inexplicable polluting industries, really.
Well, because and of course you've made quite a few allegations of a very general nature there, but what I would say is that, well, first of all, our mission hasn't changed. It's written into the Act which established us. And we can't get away from it, therefore. Our primary purpose is to protect or enhance the environment taken as a whole so as to make a contribution to sustainable development. That is what it says in the Environment Act, and that is actually what we do. And I would want to assure you that we actually do take the environmental risks very, very seriously. We don't say they don't exist. They do exist, actually, and they need to be properly and carefully managed. And good people like yourself need to have confidence that we are doing our job properly, which is, why we have been very, and will continue to be, very proactive about the way that we engage with the development of this industry, and also listen, actually, because if at some stage you think that in the way in which we're doing this, that we're not doing it properly, then we want to know about that, because we want to be able to respond to that. And I do think in general we have a very good record of the way in which we have regulated industry in this country. And indeed you're right to say that the sort of framework of regulation we have for this particular industrial activity is quite similar to the frameworks that we have for for others. I'm not saying that we have never made a mistake. We have undoubtedly done so. You may have found some instances where we did, and I hope that we have held our hands up in those cases and done something to put it right. But
I think that's opening a story which is best discussed elsewhere, I'm sorry to say, rather than discussed here, because I'd like to give other people a chance to speak. Well, thank you very much for that. We'll let you sit down. And I want to open the discussion a bit more